Antiseptic stung my nose, the ship's reactors thrummed underfoot, and a dozen faces blurred behind my visor. Each one asked me to choose who kept breathing so the rest could fight. I was an Imperial Navy medic. What I wrote in the sickbay ledger decided assignments, futures, and who the Admiralty never learned. Those choices lived with me long after alarms faded and the corridors filled again with the routine clatter of boots. The sickbay on the light cruiser Marcellus was a corridor of white light and humming panels. Tubes ran like veins along the ceiling, and vents exhaled the same recycled air in cycles so familiar they became a metronome for my hands. The smell of antiseptic was always first, sharp, clean, a promise that we could still do something. Metal under my fingers, resin trays, the cold press of a medfoam pack. The tactile world kept my mind from drifting into the tally of names I would soon have to order. In the glow of task lights, monitors pulsed in tiny, indifferent rhythms. Each flat line felt like a lie waiting to be told. They arrived in groups. At first, a pair of boarding sentries, faces still smeared with smoke and powder. A signal lance cut through a seam in the hull had thrown them into the wrong corridor, and their armor had done what armor was paid to do, held, but not without cost. One had a broken forearm and an eye bandaged with a strip of chainmail cloth. He cursed once, low and animal, and then went silent beneath sedation. The other limped, the motion stiff as a rigged puppet. I set splints, tuned their stimulants, and whispered inventory into the ledger. Names, ranks, known conditions. My entries were neat. Neatness reassuringly lied to me. Then the boarding skirmish bodies began to fill the berths. They came on stretchers, buckled into emergency brackets, or walked with the stubborn gait of men and women who refused to be carried. Not all fought for the same reason. A volunteer with a grin swollen half away from merriness joked about missing duty rotation. A veteran with an old tattoo of an eagle stared through me as if at a distant star. I smelled cordite and iron, and the ghost of ozone from melting servos. My hands moved to patch, to stabilize, to refuse the hollow protests of panic that wanted to snarl me out of rhythm. I kept my voice low. Low voices made tidy instructions and left room for hopes that would not survive the cataloging. Triage on a cruiser was never purely medical. The Marcellus was light, fast, and needed its limbs more than its hearts. I learned that early. The Admiralty valued engines and gun crews, not the sentimental comfort of keeping rear details comfortable. When I clipped a chest seal or reset a collar, I also read the shape of a campaign into the wound. A hull breach that had sheared a limb meant a replacement pump or a new gunner. An infection that would cost weeks meant a ship might lose its navigator for longer than the Admiralty's patience allowed. Every wound had strategic gravity if you knew how to weigh it. The captain came down to the sickbay with the gait of someone who kept time with the ship's clockwork and never let it slip. He was not a man of many words. His uniform bore the burn of a brazed sleeve, and his face had the map of someone who'd learned to make hard choices far from a window. He stood by the main rack and watched me work while the Medici techs readied transfusions. He asked for names quietly, like a priest asking for confessions that would not be forgiven. "Manifest," he said, voice flat. "Who is fit for duty? Who do I list as available? There are questions that carry bullets and others that carry chains." His question carried both. I laid out the current roster, names, blood types, the small clinical notes that hid the fuller truth. When a man could hold a rifle in 2 days, but not stand the weight of a watch for more than an hour, that was the sort of truth the ledger swallowed and spit back as neat columns. I reported with the calm of someone trained to make facts of soft things. "Leave the gunner on sickbay sedation," I said, "but mark him conserve. He can rotate back in 72 hours if nothing goes wrong." He nodded once, an inclination of a head like a balance catching. His eyes flicked over another patient. "That tech," he asked, "will he be able to maintain the forward generator?" The tech's jaw was wired. His breathing was shallow. I checked the monitor, felt for a pulse that wanted to be steady and wasn't. If we keep him sedated and escalate fluids, we can buy time. He won't be fully reliable for a shift yet. 50%, if we're generous. He said nothing for a long second. In the deck plates below us, the reactors sang a deeper chord. Decisions did not look like decisions in the moment. They were small surrenders, tiny cuts of ink across a ledger that would be read later by a dozen hands and judged by commanders 3 decks removed. I watched his face, trying to carry the weight for both of us. The Admiralty's priorities arrived as an order across the Vox, clipped and dense. Protocol demanded we obey. Expedience demanded we interpret. The message listed objectives, a priority line, and the cold arithmetic of lives needed to meet them. In the static of the channel, the word expendable never appeared, but the implication threaded every syllable. The Admiral did not ask to save the dockmaster who kept supplies. He asked whether we could spare a navigator for a hot transjump. The difference is the marrow of war. When the comm frayed into a recorded instruction, the medtechs listened, and I watched their expressions fold inward. Faces that had been taut with adrenaline softened into the weary knowledge of systems. The voice on the line did not hesitate. Why would it? Hesitation was expensive. All available medical personnel are to prioritize limbs to restore immediate combat functionality, the message said. Non-combat specialists will be cataloged and held until after mission completion unless otherwise directed. Closed my eyes for a breath. The order simplified things at the cost of cruelty. It gave me a compass and took away a map. It meant I had to mark more than wounds. I had to mark the future of people I had just patched. Names became tokens of utility, and my ink reverberated farther than my hands. I thought of the technician whose laugh I had heard over the cryo bay last watch. He would have been a navigator in peacetime, but now was a cog in a machine that measured him by the weight he could bear on a battle station. In the chaos, the ledger felt like a small altar. The Marcellus sickbay folder was a heavy thing, leather-edged, its papers already stained with coffee and antiseptic, and the smudges of fingers that had trembled for reasons both personal and professional. I opened to a clean page and let the tip of my stylus hover. The names waited like small lives. The lines of the page stretched the way a sea horizon does when you are trying to decide which way to turn the prow. A young gunner with a tremor in his left hand caught my eye. He could have been 16 if appearances lied kindly. He told me about a sister once, somewhere back on a transport, and how she loved to watch rain from a porthole. He did not cry when I set a bandage, but he asked me if the Admiral would know he had not fired his weapon that day. The innocence in that question made the ledger feel heavier than it had any right to. "Write him down as combat limited," I said, and the words tasted like metal. The captain's reply was a single, small sound: approval, fatigue, something worn down by endless repetition. He moved away then, to argue with the chief engineer about the possibility of a patch on the outer hull. I heard the distant bounce of an argument. The ship radiated many small crises. In the center of my sight, the ledger remained open. The stylus in my hand hummed faintly with the same frequency as the ship. Ink is a strange communion. It makes final what was only a suggestion. The Admiralty's priorities tightened with each passing minute. Another Vox scratch announced incoming reinforcements, but on a schedule that made the incoming crew worthless for the next cycle. The Marcellus could either limp toward the rendezvous with a skeleton crew and the possibility of being outmaneuvered, or she could strip personnel from non-essential watch and sail full, hungry, and dangerous. My marks could tip that scale. I measured the weight of that responsibility by the same metric I used for wounds: a pulse, a breath, a steadying hand. Each measurement carried a decision. It is easy to say you carry duty as if it were a badge. The weight of it is not metallic, but bone deep, a persistent ache in the sternum. I had learned to sleep in fragments because my ledger did not let me rest. Faces replayed behind my lids: the gunner who laughed at nothing, the veteran with an eagle tattoo, the tech whose hands trembled around loose wires. They all wanted the same thing from me in differing accents: time, hope, certainty. I could give only 2 of those at once. The next wave of arrivals was lighter. The boarding party that had attacked our starboard corridor had been repelled and left casualties distributed like evidence. Some came with their names intact and their pride in tatters. Others came nameless. A pair of void-born Marines argued in a voice too low to be heard, their breath steaming in the cold of the triage light. One asked quietly whether we would keep him in case the hull watch needed reinforcements. The other said simply that he had family on a world the Admiralty had already reassigned. I bent over the ledger and began to mark. My handwriting was small and practiced, the result of years of writing names that would not be sung about. The stylus skirted over the page, leaving dark, decisive ink. For each mark, a future shifted. For each designation of fit or conserve, a watch might be manned, a gun may fire true, or a convoy might run the gauntlet unscathed. The calculus of triage is not bloodless, it is terribly human. When the Admiralty's order repeated, more pointed now and routed through the captain's private line, I felt the ledger shiver under my palm. The message contained a specific request: priority to engine and navigation crews, certain specialists to be withheld unless explicitly cleared by an Admiralty officer. The captain looked at me, his eyes asking a question I had not thought to catalog on my training list. "Do it then," he said. "Make the call." His authority was a blade. The ledger was already open. My hand hovered over the names of 2 specialists, one a navigator whose scans were dim with concussion, the other an engine tech whose hands were paper-thin from burns. To mark either as available felt like a theft. To mark either as deferred felt like betrayal. Neither choice carried absolution. I drew the stylus to the page and felt the fine pressure before the ink gave. Then the channel stuttered, the lights flickered, and a distant klaxon rolled through the decks. The sickbay swelled with motion as if the ship had inhaled sharply. Someone shouted distant orders. The captain straightened, the lines on his face folding into readiness. The Admiralty's priorities looped in my mind like a drumbeat. My hand moved, driven by training and terror both, to write a name that would shift the balance of this campaign. I made the first mark and then paused, the stylus above the fresh black line. The next choice lay waiting. The next decision hung like a breath between 2 callers. I remembered rain on a porthole and a laugh, and the scent of antiseptic stinging my nose. I remembered the way the reactors thrummed beneath our feet, unjudging. I remembered that the ledger did not forgive. My hand steadied, and I prepared to make the next mark. The riveter's hands trembled around the spanner like someone holding a candle in a gale. Metal sang beneath his gloves, a thin, high note that matched the engine's heartbeat. He blinked, and the light doubled. For a moment when he tried to speak, the words came slurred, as if someone had smeared oil over the sound. I remembered the look, pale, 2 still pupils, the little tremor under the jaw. And I knew the canonical list of diagnoses by the rhythm of a face. But lists and rhythm were for clean hospital bays, not for the belly of a warship where 1,000 tons of thrust depended on one man's stubborn fingers. I had 1 chempack and a handful of sedatives. That was the truth I carried in my satchel like contraband. Medical doctrine said more: quarantine, formal notification, Seal the bay, deploy the ward surgeons. The doctrine had rooms, time, and tribunal patience. The engine room had none of those luxuries. The riveter, Tav, kept the feed hoppers clear and the compression rings on time. If he could not make it back to the core, the engine would cough and the ship would drift, a slow sinking corpse in a war zone. I had to choose. I remember the metal under my palms, cold as a promise. The smell of oil was high and sweet. Something in the air stung my nose, like hot metal and old smoke. Tav's breath fogged the visor of his mask, shallow and quick. He could have been any deckhand, the sort that whistled while they worked and refused shore leave twice for extra overtime. You learn people in detail when their survival keeps you warm at night. I knew the sound of his cough had changed. It was a dry, schematic cough, like a valve not seating. Small things, but in the dark they become important. There was no ceremony to my choice. I had a chem pack, a mesh-wrapped ampule of stabilized reagents, and 2 small vials of sedative. The chem pack was expensive doctrine distilled into a glass stick, bolstered circulation, suppressed certain systemic inflammations, called down fevers, depending on how you administered it. Protocol required analysis, blood swabs, a sealed chain of custody. I had protocols written in the bunks of my training and the smell of antiseptic in my nose. But a protocol is only valuable when the ship's hull is not the thing that will fail next. I told him I would help. He barked a laugh that ended ugly in his throat. "Don't make me quit," he said. "The Corps hates new hands." "Neither do I said. My voice was calm because calm was the only neutral thing I could give him. His hands found mine, and the gloves came off to the stink of soap and metal. Fingers were warmer than I expected, too warm, like someone leaving a lantern on the skin. I felt for a pulse at his wrist. It fluttered, not solid like a drumbeat, but not a dying ember either. Under normal circumstances, I would have sent him to the med bay and set a watch. Instead, I unwrapped the chem pack and wet my tongue on the thin, metallic taste of the seal. I did not follow the packet instructions. The chemist in me recoiled, then folded the medic in me measured by a different scale. If I gave Tav a full dose, and then he slumped into a coma, I would have acid on my hands and a captain who counted rules with teeth. If I withheld and he failed back in the engine room, we all failed. So I did something in between, an improvisation that had no place in textbooks but fit neatly into the geometry of desperation. I diluted the chem pack with saline from a maintenance bag instead of the certified diluent. It was a small tactical lie that carried big ethical weight. I used half the ampule and layered the sedative in microdoses, tacked beneath the skin where absorption was slower. It felt like performing a prayer to a god that had never kept its promises. Chemoderivatives thinned and stilled the fever. The sedatives clipped the jagged edges of delirium. You could almost watch the skin settle back into its proper map. Tav's eyelids became heavy. Conversation thinned to a breath, and then quiet. The danger of the procedure was not in the needle, but in the paperwork. If anyone in the medical hierarchy compared notes, it would show as an anomaly in the medlog, a chem pack used outside the bay, a sedative administered without authorization, vitals that didn't match the recorded timeline. To falsify a record for operational necessity was a slow-burning crime. It would put the ward surgeons in a position to argue censure, the captain in a position to prefer martyrdom over leniency. And yet, while those tribunals might chew me up later, they would not fix the engine if the riveter broke down on the cold walkback. I wiped his brow with a rag, all the while listening to the engine's quiet complaint. The vibration thrummed into the bone of my forearm. My hands shook when I straightened. Tav's breath balanced, then took on a deeper, steadier rhythm. He blinked open and there was a clarity in his stare, like a broken lens reset. "Feels like someone set a furnace in my chest," he murmured. "You're coming back to the engine," I said. The words were a plan, not a question. Protocol would have weighed in the other direction, but plans are measured by what they save. He fumbled for his respirator and balked at how much space there was in his chest for every breath now. I gave him a small compress, cool against the lips of his throat, and he took it gratefully. We dressed him the way you dress a man who is expected to walk through fire. I sealed a field bandage against potential contamination and wrote a shorthand entry into my wrist pad. No names, no chemical specifics, just the barest log that would satisfy an instrument that could be audited. It felt like chiseling a lie into stone. I hid the Chempac's spent ampule inside my palm until I could conceal it in the med locker behind a stack of theater scrubs. The ampule was a smoking thing in my hand, proof of what I had done. The act of concealment made my jaw ache. We moved down the corridor. Metal rang under our boots like a prelude. The corridor was a tube of dim lights, and the air hummed with heating ducts. Tav leaned on me, and for a moment I let myself think of the practical things, getting him back to the turbine access, leaving a watch, checking seals. It was all small inventory against the fact that there were 2 sentry drones in the engine throat who liked to scan hands, and the quartermaster who filed complaints like lead. If someone scanned Tav and found the altered vitals, the ship's internal audit would flag my badge. If they ran a med scan and saw the chems, the consequences would be a slow, bureaucratic death for everyone who'd relied on my silence. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered, half to me and half to the steel around us. "I had a choice," I said. "I chose the engines." He laughed once, sharp. "You chose the wrong worship, Doc." "Maybe. But worship is what you have when the universe hands you nothing but duties." I thought of my training, oath recited cold in winter light, fingers wrapped around the same phrases I now bent back on the altar. I had sworn to save life where I could. I had also swore to follow command. Those oaths did not reconcile neatly. They bled into each other. We reached the bulkhead to the access ladder. The maintenance lights there sputtered like old teeth. Through the access, we could see the core's flank, monstrous and patient. Sparks leaped across a patch where the plating had been nibbled by coolant. The engine room was no place for a med bay. It was an animal fenced in with heat-resistant plating. Tav looked at the ladder, and then at me. "He could go," he said, with the stubbornness of someone who had been told his job keeps a ship from becoming a drifting tomb. "Don't push it," I told him. "If you feel worse, you get out, and you stay out. Promise me the watch," he said. "It'll do better," I replied. I lied. I meant it'd sit on my hands in the shadow of the core and watch him like a parent watches a child's fever. I could not say the truth, that the watch would be a dangerous thing to schedule because the ship's roster was a knife, and I had already cleaned the blood from one edge. He climbed, slow and deliberate, every foot taken like a prayer. I waited at the base until he reached the rail, and I could see his shoulders straighten under the weight of the harness. When his hands slid back into the rhythm against the machine, his body remembered the tasks it had done 1,000 times. He was small against the engine's bulk, a human hinge that kept titanic pieces of steel from grinding into themselves. The engine accepted him like a machine accepts someone who knows its mood. You could see it in how he set his hands and how the servos hummed louder, relieved. I left him there, and I closed the maintenance hatch behind me with the soft click of a crime. The sound stayed in my ribs long after the metal sealed. Down in the corridor, I had to decide what to do with the rest of my day and the rest of my career. I could report him, hand him to the med bay, and fill forms like confessions. I could mark the entry as an emergency intervention, the language of absolution, or I could alter the log and pretend nothing had happened. Each choice was a plank on a bridge, and only one would take me forward without falling. I moved toward the med locker with my steps even and deliberate. The corridor lights cast my shadow long and thin. My hand went to the wrist pad where I had scrawled the shorthand. The pad's screen glowed, a sterile thing that held more truth than I felt comfortable owning. I opened the file and my thumb hovered over the archive key. I imagined the cold file room where auditors wore expressionless masks and flicked a paper every time a ship's misfortune needed a scapegoat. I imagined my name on that sheet and the faces of the men who depended on me. The image closed like a trap door. Someone called out from down the corridor. A voice I recognized, low, authoritatively bored. "Medic, you on duty?" It was one of the engineering supervisors. He walked toward me with 2 data carriers clamped under his arm, concern wrapped in the everyday. His gait said routine checks, and the tone said paperwork. I could feel the small Chempak ampule in my pocket, like a shard. I felt my throat tighten. "I am," I said. The lie felt round and complete. "Good," he said. "We got a directive from the bridge. Core diagnostics. They'll be running a wide scan within the hour. Keep the men available for inspection. They'll want you at the feed hopper access." The world rearranged itself in that sentence. Scan. Inspection. A wide sweep that could find what I had hidden as easily as a trawler scoops fish. The captain's policies were impersonal, but efficient. A scan would reveal the altered vitals. An inspection would prompt paperwork. The small private miracle I had performed would become a public litany. The supervisor's boots faded down the corridor and left a wake of hot metal scent. I tapped my wrist pad and opened the medlog entry with shaking fingers. The cursor blinked, impartial and hungry. I thought about the engine's deep voice, its willingness to stay alive. I thought about Tav up in the throat, fingers moving, a man who had no idea of the balance of debt that had been created in the space between 2 shots. I thought about my oath, and about what it meant when the only available salvation required a lie. My fingers hovered over the keys. If I falsified the entry, I would likely avoid immediate trouble. I would save a man, and maybe the ship for today. Tomorrow was a different calculus. If I logged the emergency intervention, I would invite inquiry, but also place an official mark on the action that might shield us under the doctrine of necessity. Either way had consequences. Neither was pure. I took the pad to a corner and opened a new file, one without my badge attached. The ship hummed around me like a sleeping animal, uneasy in its dream. The diagnostic sweep would start soon. I had to choose. I had to commit. My hand hovered above the archive key for a moment longer, for the space where a single breath could stretch a lifetime. Then I began to type, not the neat, clean truth, nor the bald fabrication that would have made me comfortable. I crafted a third, path, an official-sounding note of stabilization and observation, with wording that left room for institutional mercy without betraying the specifics. It was a sentence that walked along a razor, practical and small. It might not hold against formal scrutiny, but it would buy us a measure of time. As the words settled on the screen, I heard the distant klaxon that meant a bridge directive was incoming. My fingers moved faster, shaping the record into something plausible. I felt the weight of the hidden ampule in my pocket, the warm core of my complicity. The diagnostic sweep would start in minutes. I had faked a document that might shield us, but that was only paper. The real test would be whether Tav could keep the engine singing and whether I could keep my hands clean enough to stand before the auditors. I hit submit, and the pad told me the entry had been queued. The queue would be read by scanners and sent upward. For now, it would sit in the medlogs flow like a leaf waiting to be inspected. I slipped the ampule into the med locker behind the scrub stack and latched the door. The ship's hull shuddered, a small jolt that ran under everyone's feet. The diagnostics began. I walked toward the engine throat with the feeling of someone walking into a storm, and in every step I rehearsed the only prayer I had. Keep him alive. Keep the engine alive. Keep the secret long enough for it to matter. The smell of charred ink hung in my nostrils like a warning bell. I felt it there when Lieutenant Var stood over me, palms flat on the ledger as if he could feel the heat through the vellum. The burn mark on the corner had already begun to curl into black lace. I kept my left hand clamped over the pocket where the stub of what Eid destroyed had gone. My fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the memory of the man with oil-stained fingers who had held my hand while I tied a clamp to a bleeding conduit and insisted he would rather burn than let a reactor die. Var's eyes were small and dry when he looked up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The way he counted the signatures, the way his knuckle tapped the margin, said more than any accusation. "You made an entry for a corporal who never existed," he said. Each word was measured, the cadence of an auditor who had learned how to make a sentence into a trap. Or, "You removed one, I should have named the man." It would have been simple then. A name, a rank, a reprimand, a transfer off the engine deck. The sanction would have been a neat line through his life and mine. Instead, I had folded that life into a wordless smear of ash and hidden it where none of them would look. I was correcting duplicates, I lied, the words tasting of old glue and metal. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. Chief Surgeon Halbrecht leaned on the console, his gaunt face a map of exhausted lines. His pointer finger scraped a blot on the page as if to find where truth had sunk. "Correcting duplicates does not account for missing signatures," he said. He was soft with the men, by necessity, by habit, and yet the surgeon could be as merciless as any officer when repair or medicine required order. "You endanger us when you alter records. Lie to me in a time of routine, and they'll think you lie under stress. Today is not a time for riddles." The bulkhead thrummed. A strain of sound like distant steel being wound too tight ran through the ship. The bridge's voice came over the intercom, low and urgent. "Battle stations, all hands to combat." The words were the same as always, and different. They made the air taste like iron. Var did not take his hands from the ledger. He turned a page with the deftness of someone who had read thousands of lies and learned to find the one that would topple them all. "You understand the implications?" he asked. That question was a scalpel. There was no audience but the three of us, but it felt like the whole ship stood behind him, waiting to see if I would cut myself free or keep the rope around someone else. I did understand. I understood that if I spoke the name now, if I gave him the facts of how the corporal had sealed that hairline crack in the secondary coil with a makeshift brace and a prayer, then security would take the man from the reactor and place him under guard. They would be thorough. They would question the man in a cold room and look for signs of tampering. They would place a watch on the engine deck. The reactor would go cold, slowly, painfully, in the way living things die under too bright lights, and the guns would lose their breath. If I kept my mouth shut, the man stayed at the reactor. The ship kept its heat. The guns spun up. One choice was a ledger made true by duty. The other, a ledger turned false to preserve life. Both choices would eat me. "You could report me," I said. The admission came out like a confession because it was one, though it left the core of the crime unnamed. "You could put it up the chain. Illuminate this scribble like it's the lantern of some moral saint. Many things will change. People will be moved. Arrests will happen, perhaps, or maybe nobody will notice, or maybe they'll notice and not care." Var's mouth tightened as if pain had found him. "Audits are not moralizing," he said. "They are the law's teeth. They bite when you try to keep a rot secret." Halbrecht's voice was quieter. "And yet there are times when the teeth must be sheathed," he said. He looked at me not as an officer and not as a surgeon, but as someone who had once, perhaps, held a ledger, and had to choose between ink and a heartbeat. We are about to hurl ourselves into broken space. The reactor is the ship's flank. If it falters, the guns will die, and those who live by them will not have you to blame. The corridor outside the medbay vibrated as if the ship were shuddering to take a breath. Somewhere forward, a gun crew shouted a joke I couldn't hear. The rhythm of bootsteps grew louder. Even the hum of the hospital lamps seemed to speed up in sympathy. I felt the ledger under my palm. Its pages were warm from my hands, as if the book itself had absorbed my indecision. I thought of the man who had fixed the reactor, his knuckles raw, his hair flecked with grit, the way he had laughed at his own clumsy oath to keep the ship alive. I thought of the small, absurd pleasures he had confessed to me once through clenched teeth. A cup of black coffee stolen between shifts, a wife who kept his letters folded into the seam of a uniform, the vow that if he ever got to stop flying, he would grow something green. Tiny things that made him human. Tiny things that would be crushed under the bureaucracy if his name were dragged up in spite of necessity. Albrecht folded his arms. "You were wrong to excise that page without record," he said, "and you may yet be wrong to lie about it. But right now our priority is not ledger ethics, it is survival." Var's jaw moved. He had the look of a man weighing law against ruin and finding both heavy. "An auditor is not blind," he said, softer. "I can delay a report until after an engagement. But you must give me an accounting. Why did you remove the signature? Who stood where they should not have? If the story is a lie, then I will know. Because he would have been pulled," I said. The words were tight in my chest. Because I could not risk losing him to a ledger when the reactor needed hands. There was an easy silence, the kind that comes when three people understand the shape of a decision and refrain from filling it with noise. Around us, the ship shouted its preparations, a clang of metal doors, the rustle of armor, the distant prayer of a junior officer asking old saints for new luck. The med bay's air tasted of antiseptic and burned vellum, and somewhere beyond, the reactor thrummed with the effort of a heart that could not fail. Var closed the ledger gently, as if one could seal the potential of a truth by simple motion. "You will write a supplemental entry," he said. "Not a confession, not a lie for the record. An addendum to make the chain of custody appear continuous while preserving operational necessity. You will sign it. I will initial. It will not be flagged in the first pass. But understand this, if I later find this was theft of honesty for personal reasons, I will file a report. You will also ensure the man stays at his post," Albrecht added. His eyes were direct. "You will make whatever arrangement is necessary to keep him working. You will accept responsibility for that decision if it is yours alone." So the bargain was shaped. It was not mercy, it was a pragmatic truce, a piece of compromise soldered under stress. I nodded. The motion felt like giving my own throat into a warding grip. "Very well," I said. "But if anything happens to him while they watch us all, then the ledger will be the least of my failures." Var's fingers brushed mine as he took the pen. For a second, no more, his look said both accusation and understanding. He added 4 neat strokes to my handwriting, his initials a kind of collusion. "The pen's scratch on vellum was louder than it should have been," I wrote. The words were careful, phrased to make absence into precaution. I changed a date by a single digit. I added a line about transitory reassignment pending verification, a phrase so dry it could be baked into the ship's own bones. The man who had fixed the reactor became, in ink, a placeholder, a note made to preserve continuity, a bureaucratic smokescreen that would allow him to remain where he could keep the ship alive. When I was done, Albrecht folded the page, then refolded it again until it looked as if nothing had happened. He burned the edges with his candlelight just enough to darken them, to give the addendum a patina of inevitability. He then handed the ledger back to me, his gesture normal, as if we had simply performed a routine correction. No ceremony, no judgment. Only the businesslike movements of men who keep ships alive. Outside, the alarm switched to a higher cadence. The ship's bones sang under the accelerations of readiness. The hum of the reactor deepened, as if satisfied by the promise of hands at its coil. Somewhere distant, somewhere closer, gun crews took their positions. I could hear the scrape of a safety lever, the low chant of a crew chief running checks. Var did not leave. He stood and folded his hands behind his back, as auditors do, and watched us as if he would store the scene for later examination. "You will make no more of these edits without consultation," he said. "Once the engagement is over, I will conduct a full audit. If your edits were purely to preserve function and human life, there will be leniency. If not..." He let the rest dangle. Halbrecht put a hand on my shoulder. It was brief but firm, the kind of pressure that transferred duty like a coin from one palm to another. "Tend to your patients," he said. "Tend to them, and tend to your hands. The rest will follow." I left the med bay with the ledger under my arm like a shield against the cold. The corridor smelled of oil and varnish, the deck plates humming underfoot, as if the ship itself were pacing toward a decision. I passed a squad of gunners whose faces were taut with the same quiet dread I felt. A dread made of boredom, of fear, and of that strange pride that comes from being a small component in a larger mechanism designed to kill and survive. There was a part of me that wanted to vomit the whole thing into the nearest waste chute and run until the stars swallowed me. There was another part that wanted to go straight to the engine deck, thrust the ledger into the hands of the man who had fixed the reactor, and tell him everything. Names, signatures, the ash in the pocket, my promise to him. He would likely slap my wrist, for men like him were practical and unsentimental. He might even laugh and tell me to get back to the med bay. He might also look at me with an appraisal that would make me wish the ledger had remained unsullied. I did not go to the engine deck. Halbrecht had told me to tend to my patients. The ship had no time for confessions. My hands were stained with something heavier than ink. Now they trembled with the knowledge that my ledger was both shield and lie. As I reached the med bay door, the voice of the captain pulsed through the corridor. "Engage at will. Hold formation. Watch for thermal cuts." The directive was precise, unadorned. It meant the moment of decision had arrived for more than just me. I drove the med bay door open and stepped into fluorescent light. The smell of antiseptic wrapped around me. Trays clinked. A junior medic looked up with eyes that were still too young to hold the calm most of us had learned. "Med doctor?" he asked. "We have incoming casualties, sir." I tucked the ledger under the fold of my arm, feeling the burn-scarred corner press into my ribs. My mouth tasted of metal and half-truths. I had made my choice for now, but the ledger would not stay quiet forever. It would speak when Var's audit returned, when a shell blew a corridor wide, when security had time and appetite to open sealed doors. Until then, it lay with me like an ember. "Ready the triage," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. "Prep for burns. Prepare for compression injuries. Have an extraction ready for the engine deck if needed." The junior medic nodded and moved. The med bay sprang into ordered motion. Machines sighed and lit up. Men crossed the floor with bandages and cauterizing irons, with steady hands and eyes that knew how short the space was between help and harm. I set the ledger on the prep table and let my fingers rest on top of it as if to hold the lie in place. The hull vibrated again, harder this time. The ship took a step into the dark, and everyone aboard found themselves answering it with whatever small faith they had. I had kept a man at his post. I had made a ledger into a shield. The choice radiated outward like heat. What I had not done was make it right. There would be consequences. There would be questions. There would be a time when truth and survival would confront one another in a way that no addendum could reconcile. For now, there were bodies to mend and a ship to keep breathing. For now, I worked with steady motion, hands that could turn ink into medicine and medicine into chances. The ledger sat beneath my palm like a promise and a threat, and as the first shouts from the forward batteries came through, I felt the shape of the next decision harden in my chest. The alarm came like a fist through the hull. It was not the high, clean ring of routine drills. It was a ragged animal keening that bucked the deck beneath my boots and set the lights to a stuttering red-breath rhythm. I had barely finished lacing the last bandage across a scraped forearm when the ship shuddered and the corridor thermal vents spat a hiss of hot air. The riveter stopped mid-sentence and stared at me as if the sound belonged to someone else. He was still that man at the bench, bent shoulder and grease in the eye, cut of his skin. But something had moved through him and lodged there. His hands trembled not from exertion, but from some thought that would not let go. He wiped his palms on his overalls when he thought I wasn't looking. When we passed, he looked away as if my eyes might catch and press something secret into him. The crew noticed. They were small things at first, an extra distance in conversation, a late reply that never quite reached laughter. And then the whispers spread like mold the moment the lights dimmed. Whispers had weight on a ship. They dislodged the quiet that kept a fleet of strangers tethered. Quiet is not silence. It is the particular hush of tasks being done and trusts not tested. Once that hush falters, the easiest tool is suspicion. I felt it in the way two mechanics exchanged glances when I checked their vitals, in the way the young loader pretended not to see me counting syringes. Trust frayed into small accusations that built teeth. Then someone banged on the bulkhead and the world tilted. The outer decks had already reported contact. They'd been calling for boarding craft on an open channel. We were supposed to have warning and a cordon, but the corridor doors had convulsed inward, and the smell of ozone and burning composite came through fresh. I saw the first boarder in our light, and it was the kind of ugliness that made the throat seize. A shadow moving in a pattern no human should know, a scrape of metal like fingernails on alloy. It wasn't an appearance, it was a calculus. This ship, these decks, the space between my ribs where the decision lived. They hurt people. They did not tear them wholly apart. There is a dark mercy in that. They left hands crushed, faces stunned, lungs shocked, the kind of injuries that did not scream but pulsed like a second heartbeat. Slow, demanding, and merciless in the time it took to decide. I moved among them with the old motions: press, bind, breathe. My fingers knew the routines even when my head did not. The smell of alcohol and machine oil mixed with a metallic tang at the back of my mouth. I tasted it every time I leaned in close to listen for quiet breathing. Then the order came down, clipped and clean through the channel. Contain breach, protect core. Chief to reactor, priority. No grand speeches, no time to breathe. I knew who the chief was without needing his name. He had been a lanky presence on the lower deck, the sort who stayed late to measure coolant flow with a cigarette stubbed between his lips. He could mend a streaking reactor with a hand-sawn skill that made engineers swear in praise. If he lived and could get to the core, we might seal the breach and keep the ship whole. But he was hit. They had splintered the corridor near his workshop. I found him slumped against a bulkhead under a tarp, the blue of his eyes dulled by some chemical that glittered at the edge of his sleeve. He was breathing, but the breath came rasped and thin. His fingers twitched in the glove like a man trying to remember a tune. He looked at me when I crouched, and his eyes searched with a child's urgency for a word he could not find. He was the one who could save the reactor. The reactor was the spine of the ship. The ship was our only argument for life. I had one proper antidote left: I had counted them twice, then again under the lights when the riveter had been gone and the locker rattled like an empty throat. It was a true formulation, distilled and vetted. No field substitute held that speed of reversal. The rest were bandages, pain patches, improvisations that bought minutes and then surrendered them. The antidote would pull the toxin from the chief's system if I could get it into him now. It would steady his hands and give him the time he needed, or I could make it go the other way. I could fraction it into smaller doses, turn a single cure into a handful of lifebuoy splashes. Spread thin, it would reduce nausea and slow the toxins. Heartless spread enough that a dozen or more might keep shooting, dragging wounded bodies to cover, buying the deck time to burn and bruise, but not collapse entirely. More men kept fighting might drive the boarders back from the bulkheads. That was the math laid out in the metal of the corridor. One life with a chance to save many, or many lives with no sure salvation of the ship itself. The crew argued without speaking. The riveter stood with his tool belt like a man who has learned to hold metal to steady his nerves. He saw the syringe in my hand and his face went hard. "Save him," he mouthed. It was not a command. It was a plea pried thin and handed over like contraband. Behind him, a loader id bandaged earlier had pulled himself to his feet, leaning on a rail, blood caked under a torn sleeve. He watched the chief, then me, then the corridor that ran toward the reactor and back again. The cost of quiet had become numbers, and numbers do not make friends. My training had told me to triage on notice, greatest good for the greatest number, but training never sat in the body at the moment of choice, a second longer than a breath. Theory is ink on paper. This was the salt in my mouth, and the pulse in my thumb and the riveter's eyes, which were telling me to remember the times the chief had stayed 3 nights longer to keep the stacks from warping. I felt the scale tilt for reasons that were not math. I remembered the small things. The chief laughing when a bolt wouldn't budge, the way he would whistle as he checked the coolant lines, his impatience when the ledger was wrong. Memory is a poor justification at a tribunal, but it Pavloved a kinship in me that I could not ignore. When he had handed me a warm cup of tea while I patched a gash months ago, he had not asked for thanks. He would not ask now. Some debts, however, wore the stern lines of duty. The boarders moved like a tide, probing and then pressing. An engine woke somewhere above us with a violence that made the lights translate into staccato paintings. The chief's breath hitched. I could feel the toxin mapping itself through him in cold, systematic increments. It chewed at fine motor control first, fingers, wrists, and then it turned to the lungs. Each shallow inhale was a number counting down. I could feel the eyes of the crew like static. The loader had his mouth set. The riveter's face was an anvil. Resolve had replaced either suspicion or cowardice, depending on how you read him. I thought of my own hands, the way they remembered the anatomy of saving. I thought of the ship's children. If the ship died, what would be left for the men who survived? We were all heirs to some small human insistence on continuity. Even that clung to the arguing edge of truth. Someone barked from the hatch, a voice I did not have to turn to hear. Boarders at the lower corridor. 2 teams in. Weapons failure reported near Deck E. Bring out the responders. The channel closed like a snapped tendon. There would be no general getting to us with reinforcements in time. The numbers thinned with each breath. My thumb brushed the vial's label in a tiny, ritual motion. The label was smudged from my sweat and the old scrawl of supply clerks. It was small and clinical and absurdly neat against the chaos. The needle glinted with a kind of terrible promise. There is, for a medic in a ship under fire, a luminous split second where the future compresses into a point and you can feel the whole of possible outcomes like a set of doors swinging at once. I had never liked that moment. I thought of the riveter and his furtive silence. I thought of the loader who breathed as if the sound would be stolen. I thought of the chief's hands, capable hands that could perform miracles with coolant valves and live wire. And I thought, with the clarity of someone who had rehearsed this in the dark an infinite number of times, about what I would be called if I chose either course. If I saved the chief and the reactor held, the ship might live and carry us to a port where we could bury those we lost with something more than hurried prayers. I would be praised in the ledger, or at least not questioned aloud when the captains counted losses and survival. I might still be speaking to men who knew me as a medic and not as someone who had measured friends as expendable. But I would have chosen the few over the many. That would hang on me like a brand, justifiable in theory, cowardice in the mouths of the bereaved. If I distributed the antidote, I would be the one who bought more lives in the corridor. The loader would likely thank me with a broken grin. The riveter would keep his distance, but perhaps call me by name again in the smoke. Yet the reactor would be unattended. The ship could fail, and the consequences for those spared in the moment might be non-existence at a broader scale. I would be the medic who chose the immediate human circle over the vessel that held them in quiet hours. Men might call that weakness. There was no right answer. There was only the answer I would make with the tools at hand. The riveter took a step toward me then, closing the last of the space between suspicion and collaboration. He had oil on his knuckles and guilt in his jaw. "Do what you have to," he said, voice low enough to be private, even in a corridor where every shout echoed. I wanted to be clever. I wanted to divide the vial in a way that would satisfy both arithmetic and conscience, to scrawl the ledger ringing both hope and compromise. But the vial was not made for dividing in a field lit by emergency flares. It was meant for single, dedicated use. Every fraction would dilute its effect. It would, at best, grant a dozen temporary reprieves and, at worst, render nothing effective at all. The chief's fingers curled against the bulkhead, mapping the alloy like it was his only resist. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that had nothing to do with the present and everything to do with the work that could be done if his hands would just obey. I drew breath. The syringe felt heavy and particular in my grip, every milligram of consequence condensed into a tiny cylinder of glass and potential. Behind me, the corridor filled with the muted staccato of boots and the far-off shout of a man who had found a weapon. Somewhere the reactor's backup alarm began its keening, a small, terrified thing. I took a step toward the chief, toward the work that might save us all, and then paused with my hand over his arm. The decision landed in my chest like a physical thing, cold and undeniable. I could still choose otherwise, could walk the length of the corridor and splice the vial's contents with trembling hands, hand out drops like prayer beads. I clenched the syringe, felt the plunger under my thumb, and made myself a promise I did not yet know how to keep. The ship screamed in its own language, the boarders pressed like tide, and I let my hand move. The engine coughed once, a dry, petulant sound like a throat clearing under metal. Then it took me, reluctantly at first, and settled to a steady, hungry purr. Heat stitched into the hull like a hand pressing to skin. The lights along the maintenance corridor switched from staccato warning to the dull, dependable glow that means something will keep you alive another hour. I listened until the hum outlasted every ache in my bones. Saving the engine was a small calculus with enormous teeth. The bridge wanted men on the guns, Marines on the pliant bulkheads to push back the boarders. The med bay needed medics and morphine. The ship needed its heart. I made the call. I let others fall back to fight. I ordered the scarce power rerouted, the pumps rebalanced. It was a choice with no pure end. It was made over the hiss of alarms and the long, low cry of a damaged turbine trying to remember its rhythm. They called it ingenuity in the morning brief. They used words like tactical prioritization and salvage of core systems. Men in brass trimmed my sentence into a rumor. Somewhere on the bridge, a lieutenant would repeat a clipped version suitable for reports. Engine saved, casualties acceptable. They did not cite names. I had no medal pinned to my chest, no brass plaque delivered to the quarters. My name drifted through the captain's rumor mill like a half-remembered number, the one who chose. It suited the officers to boil choices down to clean policy and tidy victory. It suited me not at all. The cost was not listed on any sheet. It was a sound in the back of my memory the whole night, the quiet of boots that did not return, the soft slide of someone's breath stopping against a bulkhead. A man I had sutured together in a different fight, with ragged grin and one crooked front tooth, vanished into the quiet of duty. He did not die with a bang that my hands could catalog. He slipped into a file, into reassignment orders stamped with seals I could not read. One day he laughed at a joke in the med bay and lifted a plate of rationed stew. The next day he had been rerouted to an away-boarding crew, and the only trace was the ghost of a patch on his sleeve where I had set a stitch. To everyone else he had been redistributed. To me he was a face on a page. That ledger is small enough to hide in a palm. Leather stiffened by engine grease and disregard. I had begun the habit years before, as a thing to do when the light shifts between suture and sedation grew long. It started as names and dates. It grew teeth. I wrote down the shape of mouths, the way a man's left eyebrow arched when you told him a joke that was not funny. I drew the hospital's narrow windows and the angle of light on a scalp where I had replaced bone with wire anseram. I wrote the sound of a laugh once swallowed by coughing. Sexless notation, one line for a name, a tick if they survived, a dash if they did not. But the ledger also kept the small, private things off any official tally. A soldier's hand trembling at the sight of a little girl's drawing. He kept folded in a pocket, the way a woman hummed hymns she had not the right to remember. When I closed it, there was a soft drag of thumb across the cover. The pages smelled of oil and antiseptic, and the faint musky sweetness that clung to fabric flattened at the point of a pressure dressing. I never left it where anyone could find it. Records aboard ship are salted with formality, and signatures mine smelled like the inside of a sleeve. Sometimes I would open it at a corner and rest my forehead to the paper. It was superstition and proof both. The Imperium counted numbers. I wanted to keep those things they could not quantify. Sometimes a subroutine of the ship's communicators would throw my name like a loose coin. Medical on site, triage priority. Officers would repeat it with the distance of command. The rumors among them were kinder. They said I had kept the engine. They preferred that the moral geometry of my choice vanish into epaulets and apology. It was easier for them to speak of circuits and outcomes than of the faces I had put in the ledger. Easier, but false. I remembered the man with the crooked tooth the night the hull shuddered. He had once spat out a fragment of edible sarcasm about saints versus servo-saints as I stitched his arm. His eyes always slid away from talking about home. In the flicker of an emergency light, I found the line of his jaw, and my hands, instinctive and steady, followed the pattern. In that moment, there had been a world in which I could have gone aft to mend the plating that would seal a corridor and keep the guns manned. There had also been a world where I could have stayed forward, tending the bleeding. I chose the engine because it would keep the ship alive, because the ship kept more than us, because an engine's hum is a steady argument for tomorrow. The change came in that thin pause between orders and action. I remember touching my fingers to the bulkhead, feeling the skin of the metal like a living thing, and thinking of all the faces in the ledger whose names I had not spoken aloud in a year. The ship's heartbeat was not an abstract, it was the sum of the people who could only be remembered if there was somewhere for them to return to. So I redirected power, I rerouted the Megans. I wrote a note into the log under my own hand when the consoles blinked assent. Rerouted for core stabilization. Triage reduced to deployable kits. A voice rose on the line, high and bright with command. "Doctor," the lieutenant said, "we need you with the boarding crew. Someone has to keep the men breathing." He did not hear the calendar I held of every tuck stitch and prayer. He did not see the ledger in my satchel like a small hidden altar. "Not now," I told him, and my voice did not waver. The words sounded like the closing of a sealed hatch. It was a decision, and a wound both. There was no hero ceremony when the engine took hold. The ship stopped shuddering in a way that allowed people to stand without bracing. Men straightened what passed for uniforms. A bosun lit a cigarette in a corner and cursed the brass for making him talk about victory before he had time to grieve. The bridge decorated the success with charts and trend lines. When I went to the medbay doorway, the open space smelled of burning cloth and cleaning fluid. Bandages lay like pale flags. A corporal who had watched me through the long hours, an actual witness, not the rumor mill, looked at me the way a man looks at a thing he cannot unmake. He said nothing, only tipped his head, a small private acknowledgement that did not reach the officer's reports. I carried the ledger to the bulkhead and opened it to the page with the crooked-toothed man's name. My pen hovered. I had learned a ritual. I would write the bare fact, then a line, and if I closed the book before I could say the rest aloud, it meant I had spared myself another retelling. I put his name down, then a dash, then the time. Underneath, I wrote 3 words I never let anyone read: "Held the ship." The phrase was not true in the way the officers meant it. It was true in the way that matters in the dark. It was a confession. The ledger grew like a ledger always has, through necessity and habit and resistance. I had pages where the ink had bled when water sprayed from a burst conduit during a boarding. I had a corner where a smear of oil had made the name of a boy who had been first to die on some distant world unreadable. Some nights I would whisper every name into the thin air of my quarters like a litany, and if the ship's walls could listen, they would have known what the officers did not. There is a difference between saving a machine and saving the people it carries. The Imperium counted lives in heads and ration chips. I counted the way a mouth looked when someone tried to smile through a fever. A rumor suited the officers because it left no witnesses to uncomfortable acts. They could sign forms and paste on commendations to the engine crew. They could not measure what I had done under a red emergency light, choosing which faces to carry forward and which to leave as ghosts. That was my burden. It did not fit into any chain of command. It did not require a signature. There were nights when I thought of leaving the ledger open on the mess table and walking the plating until the hull became a maze I could not navigate by stars. I imagined tossing it into an airlock and watching the faces drift black and small against the void. I never did. The thought was a cruelty I did not have the appetite for. To erase the ledger was to erase the only proof I had that every life mattered, even if the brass did not note it. I had already closed the book more than once and slid it into the satchel against my hip when a hand landed on my shoulder. It was a touch that had no business being gentle in such a place. Calloused, warm, steady. I looked up. The corporal's face was a map of fatigue. He said, "You did what you had to do." His voice was grave, not a pronouncement for report, but a private verdict. "You think the engine never needed to stop?" I asked. The words were small, almost ridiculous in the face of the heat and the static. The question was not for him. It was for the ledger on my hip, for the man with the crooked tooth, for the ghosts that only I could count. He did not answer. He only squeezed my shoulder once and walked away. I watched him go, the set of his shoulders like a man carrying his own ledger. We were all keepers in our own way. I locked the satchel and slid the strap across my chest. The ship hummed a low, contented note. Around us, the crew readied for the repairs that would follow this night. Panels to be replaced, seals to be reformed, hull to be burnished with hands that would be raw by dawn. Somewhere forward, a boarding party would return to an empty bunk. Somewhere else, a name would be cross-indexed into a file labeled Operational Reassignment. The machine of the Imperium moved on, indifferent and vast. It kept its own tallies. I stepped out of the med bay and felt the cool of reclaiming air after the heat of machines. The corridor smelled of oil and stale coffee. In the distance, the bridge's voice called, efficient and blind to the tremor at the center of the decisions it took for granted. I folded my hands around the strap of my satchel and felt the ledger's weight like a heart against bone. There was work to be done. The engine required a watchful hand to make sure the temporary patches held. The wounded who had made it back would need attention later, when the adrenaline bled out and pain became a full-time tenant. The ledger needed to be kept safe, and there was the small private duty no one else could volunteer for: to remember, to name, to keep the ledger alive so that the faces it held might not be reduced to an order. I moved toward the access ladder that led down to the engine room, each rung a small decision. My shadow fell long behind me, carrying with it the imprint of the faces I had not let the reports take. The ship's hum rose to greet me, a vast animal satisfied for the moment. I climbed, knowing I would make that choice again should the opportunity arise. Not because it was ceremonially right, nor because I sought praise, but because someone had to keep the count straight. At the hatch I paused, hand on the cold metal, and fingers tracing the seam. The ledger was at my heart, a private litany against the noise. I pushed the hatch open. The engine room met me with a wash of heat and the clean, terrible promise that it would work if I kept it. I dropped my bag to the floor, turned the first page of the ledger among the dim light, and read the names I had vowed not to let sink into the sea of reports. Then I put down my pen, tucked the book into my shirt beneath my coat, and climbed over the rail into the furnace of the ship's heart. The decision-making was not finished. Choices always come in the pitch after the first one, in the small, steady acts that keep people alive between the loud, public orders. I tightened a wrench, listened for a change in the tone of the turbine, and prepared for whatever would come next.